My name is Dwight Mihalicz. I'm the president of Effective Managers. I've been involved in this particular line of work in terms of thinking about and researching into organizations, organization performance, how managers perform, how we can help employees to perform at their best. So in order to do that, I started the firm Effective Managers Incorporated, and I've been doing that for almost 10 years now. Before that, I was a management consultant in organization design, but I've always been passionate about how do we help organizations to perform better. And as you'll see, I'm going to share some of my learning about that with you. So the question is, and it's not a moot point, because the question is from the title is, what is resilience? And I always like to start with the dictionary definition because that helps give some guidance. This is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today. When times get difficult, how can we ensure that our organizations are positioned to be able to react quickly and then to be able to recover quickly? And we've all been, in these times of COVID-19, big time learning how to react quickly because it's been survival mode. But now, as we're starting to think about how do we adapt and how do we move forward, the time comes to start thinking about the resilience of how do we position ourselves for the recovery phase. So I've just got a quick poll. I'll have a few polls for you as we go through this. So the first poll is, how resilient is your organization? From your perspective, is it very resilient? Is it somewhat resilient? Or is it not at all resilient? So I'd very much appreciate your quickly filling in that poll. So I'll give you just a few seconds to complete that. So we've got one very resilient, some somewhat resilient. So I think it's coming in on the somewhat resilient to the very resilient. So this is excellent news. So you've been thinking about resilience, and that's probably why you're here at this webinar. So in terms of, we'll end the polling now, and we've got a 50-50 split in terms of very resilient and somewhat resilient. So that's excellent. Oh, and look at here, I've got a button where I can share the results for you, so I can show you what the results were. So 8 of you voted, and maybe I caught you a little off guard on that one. I'll give you a bit more heads up on the next one. So in thinking about resilience, the starting point that I wanted to give us is the importance of resilience over time. In COVID-19, when that first struck, we had business as usual issues, and we started focusing immediately on things like, how do I protect my people? What is the transparency with customers? How do I stabilize my supply chain? How do I ensure that I have the working capital that I need to move forward? As we go on, then we start thinking about some of the issues that we have, moving from crisis mode to some of the more complex issues that are actually coming. Because we know that we're in a recession right now. There's a global slowdown, certainly, but what's not known is how long that's going to take. When people return to work, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to get people into offices in a way that's safe? And what is that transition period? How far out in the future will it go? And that new normal is the big question mark for us. We really don't know what that new normal is. In fact, I've been doing some writing about the new normal and saying that for all of us, it's really not very clear what that's going to be, but more to take the perspective that whatever that normal is, it is going to be new. And in fact, each day of all of our lives is a new normal because there's always change in all of our days. So we have those questions in front of us. And what we need to think about in terms of those questions are, what are some of the things that are coming that are unknown at this point? So we have some known sources of disruption, but in terms of thinking about future disruption, what might be coming in terms of either our industry, hopefully not another pandemic, hopefully not a second wave, but even those things are possible. So the path ahead then is now the survival mode, and moving from that survival mode into the adaptation phase. So what's next? What is the economic restart, and what does that look like? And as we go through that adaptation phase, how do we build resilience so that we will be resilient in an ongoing way, not only to deal with the outcome of this pandemic, but any of those future disruptions that might be coming. So today we're really going to focus in on building that resilience. And what I'd like to do today is share with you some of those things that I've seen in my experience as a manager and a head of organizations, but also my experience over the last 20 years as a management consultant in terms of those things that are getting in the way of resilience and why organizations are having such a tough time really dealing with them and figuring out how to do that. Gosh, sorry, I'm forgetting a couple of the waiting room people here, so I think I have to maybe change this for the future. Just welcome 2 new participants. Welcome, thank you, and I'm glad you can join. So what does get in the way of resilience for us in our organizations? The starting point is that most organizations are successful. And if you think about it, if the organization's not successful, it's not going to be around very long. So most organizations are successful. But from the perspective of owners of organizations, there's generally a sense that they can do things better. Yes, they're facing problems in the organization, and they're trying to resolve those problems. And generally, in the resolution of issues, you know, a lack of clarity of accountability, or people making poor decisions, or too many meetings, any of these things that happen in organizations, they try to resolve them, but not with the kinds of results that they would like to have. And the bottom line of that is that from the perspective of many owners or heads of organization, they're not able to focus in on the work that they feel that they need to focus in on, because they keep getting dragged into these issues that they would like to resolve so that they can improve performance overall. And what are those symptoms of ineffectiveness? I've written down some of them here that I see in organizations over and over again. Poor communication, silos, rework, poor quality, poor decisions, or late decisions, missed work. I think all of these will be familiar to you. All of these result in what I call organizational churn. And organizational churn contributes to this ineffectiveness in organization, because this is energy that is being spent in organizations doing things that are adding value for the organization. And we all know that this is all about adding value in our organization. How can we make sure that we in our organization are doing the absolute best we can to provide products, services in the most effective way possible? So bottom line, what do I hear from owners of organizations, or in larger organizations, sometimes the CEO, in remote organizations, sometimes the general manager? I find that they feel that they are not able to focus in on value-added work. So that work which they feel that they should be focusing in on, they're not able to focus in on it. They have a sense that everyone in the organization is working at too low a level. So people, the frontline managers, tend to be on the floor more than they should. The directors of functions within the organization are more concerned with the work of the frontline managers and troubleshooting there rather than focusing on their work, and that pulls the whole organization down. There tends to be in organizations a lack of clarity of focus. So this leads to distractions in the organization, but it also leads to this wasted energy, this churn that I mentioned in the organization. So a lot of activity, people working really hard, but for some reason the projects aren't on schedule. The budgets get overrun. There's poor collaboration across teams in terms of either work being missed or work being redone or handoffs not being clear. And as a result, that leads to silos starting to form, because people start feeling that if I'm going to get it done, I'm going to get it done within my own department. And the bottom line of all of that is that key strategic issues are not met. So the key issue that I've seen in all of these things, and we can't get into detail on it now, but the one key takeaway for you in all of those things, these examples that I've given you, is that they're at a symptomatic level. So poor communication, poor teamwork, poor collaboration are symptoms of underlying causes which are creating issues in the organization that can be resolved, but they can't be resolved at the symptomatic level. Some of you, I know I've talked with you before when I checked the list. Some of you have heard my example before of a disease. So if you're feeling ill as a person and you have a fever, you take an aspirin and you'll feel better. But that's not curing the underlying disease. So when the aspirin wears off, the disease is going to come back, the fever will come back. It's exactly the same in the organization. If we treat things at a symptomatic level, what will happen is things will look better for a while, but the underlying root cause issues have not been addressed, and that will cause as a result, those symptoms are going to reappear again. And I think all of you have seen that in your organizations. So we can map that kind of a thing. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just want to show you what some of these root cause issues are, because they start at the business model level. They're impacted by the strategy and how we develop our strategy as an organization. They're impacted by our organization design, how many layers we have, how we align our functions, how we do that work. They're impacted by fit to role. Do we have the right people in the right roles doing the right work? They're impacted by the accountability model that we use in our organizations in terms of getting people focused in on doing the right work. And they're also impacted by how we manage in the organization, whether our managers are doing their managerial leadership work. And when you look at it this way, you kind of throw up your hands and say, well, you know, in our organization, how can we deal with these things? And in fact, in my experience in working with organizations, typically it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You know, you solve this problem here, and then you go over to solve this problem, and then that one pops back up again, and you're solving a problem over here, and then another one pops up. So it's always trying to solve problems. Rather, let's think about what is that constructive approach that we can take to understand what are the key root cause issues, and then address those in a systemic way in our organization. So to help with that thinking, I've created a model. It's making an analogy of an organization to a tree. Both of them are complex systems. Trees exist in very difficult circumstances sometimes and thrive, just as some organizations with a tough business model are successful, or on the other hand, some organizations fail when it looks like their business model should be successful. So there's a lot of parallels, and by having a model like this, it can really help us to focus in on what those root cause things are that we need to focus in. So the first level of things are what I call the structural ones. So it's the business model. What business are we in? Who are our clients? What is our costing model? The strategy. How do we differentiate ourselves from our competitors in the marketplace? And it's the organization design. So that's kind of like the bedrock, the topsoil, and the root system of the tree. It lays the foundation for everything that we need to do in the organization. So that's the structure, and it needs to be in place for us to be successful. On the top of the tree, the foliage and everything, that's the outcomes. And in the outcomes section, we're concerned with the culture of our organization, because how we work together, our value set drives our culture. That culture, in terms of how we work together and how we collaborate in the organization, drives the performance. So a healthy tree, bright green leaves, is the same as a high-performing organization. And then there's the profit. If we do everything well, we have the fruit of the tree, which is the profit of the organization. So what ties together those structural elements and the outcomes of the organization? It's the people. And the people are like the trunk of the tree. It's the accountability and authority model, which is like the bark. It's the managerial leadership, the strength of our organization. So how do we manage in this organization? And it's the managerial capability. Are our managers capable of doing managerial leadership work in the organization? So those are the people things in the organization. So what I'm going to go through with you in the 30 minutes that I have left to chat with you are the 3 steps, the 3 key elements that we really need to be thinking about, and then I'll relate them back to this model so that you can see the relationships. So the first one is getting the right people into the right roles. The question that I have for you is how good a job is your organization doing at getting the right people into the right roles? So this becomes a really important consideration, because if we want to add value throughout our organization, we need to make sure that when we're putting people into roles, that they can be successful. And this is not as easy as it seems. And there's all kinds of books, many thousands of books written about this, different systems in place, and they all come at it from a different perspective. But what I want to show you here is what some of those root cause things, those root systemic things that we need to really think about when we're doing when we're appointing people into positions. If we come back to the model, there's a relationship between two systems. One is the organization design, which deals with complexity of work, and the other is managerial capability, which has to do with managerial, the capability of managers to do their managerial leadership work. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you an introduction to that. And the starting point on that is if there's a team manager role vacant. So you have a team, let's call it a sales team, and the sales manager leaves, and you want to replace the sales manager, who's usually hired to become the new sales manager? And I think the answer to the question feels intuitive, and it's usually the best salesperson becomes the next sales manager, because you have a sense that's the person that would be able to do the best job at doing the sales work. And the problem with that is that although it intuitively feels like that might be the best person, usually it's not the best person for that job. And I'm going to tell you why now. And it all comes down to scientific approach. So when you think about the power of science, the example I like to give is about gravity. If we think about apples falling from a tree, since the beginning of time, as long as there were human beings and there were fruit trees, there was a sense that when fruit was ripe and it fell, it would fall downwards. But it wasn't until Newton came along and really started doing the scientific thinking about this that he was able to describe the universal laws of gravitation. And then that led to all kinds of other discoveries. Well, exactly the same thing is true in organization design. Our Newton equivalent in organization design is Elliot Jacks. He's a Canadian. Spent his last few decades actually as a visiting professor at the University of Washington in the US. But in the 50s, working with a major manufacturing company, actually a mining company in the United Kingdom, he discovered these two principles. The first one is complexity of work, as measured by time span of discretion. So how long one is accountable for carrying the can to do work will determine the complexity of the work. The second principle is that problem-solving capability, Elliot referred to it as mental processing capability of an individual, varies from individual to individual. So you can identify the processing capability of an individual to be able to work at those different levels of complexity in the organization. So I can do a whole two-hour webinar in this one slide, but I just want to give you an introduction to the first two levels of an organization to give you a sense. So if you think about frontline workers, bakers, mechanics, bookkeepers, customer service reps in bank, people that come in the morning, they do their work and they go home. That work is fairly short duration. Usually it's one day. If you're in level one work that's a little more complex, maybe you're a lead hand or you're coaching some of your colleagues, it might go over a week or 2 weeks, sometimes in rare cases as much as 3 months into the future. And this requires a problem-solving capability that is declarative. So it requires the following of procedures. So those people who are successful in this work are able to follow the procedures from the beginning to the end. So first thing is you do this, then you do this, then you do that, and then you move on to the next thing. And if you run into a problem, then you go and see the manager to try to resolve the problem. So the important thing to remember in level one work is that it can be proceduralized. There are a finite number of decisions that are possible in terms of doing this work properly. Yes, it can be complex. If you're a diesel mechanic, the manual for repairing a diesel engine can be quite complex, but it can be put in a manual. You can diagram all of the different things that you need to troubleshoot and repair a diesel engine. When you move up to the next level of work, the frontline manager or a professional in the organization, the work changes completely, because here you're no longer following the procedures, you're developing the procedures. So you need a diagnostic capability to be able to understand the work, understand the required outcomes, to be able to gather information from as many different places as you can to be able to understand what best practices are, and then to use all of that knowledge to make decisions, to develop and to improve procedures in the organization. So that diagnostic capability of the individual to do that work is completely different from the declarative capability required for the person to be successful at level 1 work. And this is why so many promotions fail. In the sales example I gave you, that salesperson doing the level 1 declarative work might be the best salesperson because they're ideally suited for doing that work. But when you promote them to the level 2 sales manager, if they don't have that diagnostic capability, they won't be able to add the value to their former teammates in terms of understanding the work, understanding the workers, problem solving at that next level up, so that the entire department, the entire sales unit can be doing better and better work over time. So what we find in these situations is that quality goes down over time because the newly appointed manager isn't able to do the work that's necessary. And you can go through exactly the same kinds of descriptions for level 3 work, which is usually director work, which is functions in organizations, which that work goes out to 1 to 2 years into the future. It's the first level with managers of managers. And then the general management work, which is at the VP level, goes out 2 to 5 years. Many owners of organizations are at that level. So many small, medium-sized businesses have 3 or 4 levels and can be quite successful. The trick is understanding these levels of complexity. So when it comes time to appoint or promote people, you're thinking about that aspect, which becomes critically important. Now, the companion to that, the human capability, is that people will mature in this problem-solving capability over time. It's not a process that can be taught. So you can't teach someone at level 1 who is that great salesperson to have that diagnostic capability. Some people enter the workforce at level 1, mature at level 1, and are quite comfortable and capable at doing level 1 work throughout their entire period of time, their entire work career. Some people come into organizations at level 1 and mature to level 2 and quite happily retire at level 2. Some mature to level 3 and some mature to level 4. So it's like any other maturation process. When I was an adolescent, I wanted to be 6 feet tall. That was my thing, but I didn't. I topped off at 5'11". I say a half, but I think it was probably 5'11", and there's nothing I could do about that. My maturation was to get to a certain height, and that was it. So the color of my hair, these kinds of things are predetermined. A person's individual to problem solve at different levels of capability also matures. I have lots of material on the website on this, and I know that's a big pill to swallow, but it becomes really, really important because as you're thinking about how you get proper fit to role in organizations, you realize that this increasing complexity of work as you go up the organization has to be matched by this increasing capability of individuals. And as you see in the brackets here, with the right problem-solving capability, the right skills and knowledge, and that will apply themselves to the work. So in a talent pool system in our organization, then what we need to do is have problem-solving capability, skills and knowledge and application understood for everyone in the workforce. And once we have that, then we can identify the role requirements. So what's required for success in that particular role, and the overlap is the fit to role. So this gives us an ability to collaborate with each other throughout the organization. So step 2. I hope everybody wasn't seeing that polling all the way along here. So let me just get rid of these polling things from, you can close that on your screen now. I think I've got that over there. Okay, excellent. I apologize for the polling, folks. I've misstepped somewhere in the way that I set this up. So usually I have some support in this, and I thought I knew enough to do it on my own. Hey, there's a competency framework, so I didn't have the skilled knowledge that I needed to do that particular work. So I should have called on my manager or a tech support to help me out with that one. So step two, now I've got about 15 minutes left. So what I want to do is give you these examples. They're not as complex as the first one. So step two in the organization is we need to really think about how do we ensure that everyone in the organization is focused in on the right work. So in order to do that, we really are thinking about an accountability and an authority model in organizations. So the effective point of accountability is what we've developed at Effective Managers to really help describe what is that effective point of accountability in the organization, both for how we manage in this organization, but also how we collaborate in this organization. And I like to think about this as the rules of the road, because if you think about traffic and highways, if you didn't have rules of the road, it would be pandemonium. It would be gridlock. People wouldn't know what a signal light meant. They wouldn't know which side of the road to drive on. There would be no traffic lights. There might not even be any roads. So every time one car meets another car, you have to negotiate how you're going to deal with each other. So it's exactly the same inside the organization. If you don't have these rules of the road, this language for how we manage and how we collaborate, then everybody has to negotiate with each other, and it slows down the organization. It results in some of the churn that I was talking about, and in the worst case, it can result in gridlock in your organization. So what is the main driver of performance in organizations? This is a result of research that we did with the University of Ottawa, looking into managerial capability and accountability specifically. And we did find that accountability is the main driver of performance in organizations. So those organizations with higher levels of accountability had higher levels of manager effectiveness, and where manager effectiveness was higher, organization performance was higher. Notice this link in the middle, which is the manager. So managers doing their managerial leadership work, managers being capable, managers having that language for accountability and authority becomes really, really important. So we must make sure that the model is in place, and then we must make sure that managers are doing their managerial leadership work. And here's the key finding. We found this in the research, because going into it, I had a sense it was all about accountability. But my sense from working in organizations is that people do want to do well in organizations, and people did want that people were accountable. And what we found is that there's actually two dimensions in accountability. The first dimension is felt accountability. So felt accountability. How strongly do I feel accountable for doing good work? And this is almost off the charts. I mean, 0.12, it would have been an A+ in terms of a grade. So felt accountability is 8.88 out of 10 on a Likert scale. So most managers and organizations feel accountable for doing good work. There's no question about that. But the other dimension is clarity of accountability. So how clearly do I understand that for which I am going to be held accountable? And there it's 6.9 out of 10. That's a C+, and in a term exam, that's probably not a horrible mark. But if you're an organization that wants to be top performing and wants everyone to be as engaged and working as hard as possible on the right work, then C+ certainly isn't enough. And that's where we need to focus. How do we put in place systems in our organizations so that those who want to do good work can focus in on doing the right work? Because the question isn't whether or not they'll feel accountable. The question is whether or not they will feel accountable for doing the right work. So what we need to do then is, in our organization, have an effective point of accountability for managerial accountability and authority, and how that flows down the organization. And it needs to flow down the organization to the single point of accountability as low as possible in the organization, that has the capability and the resources for success. Okay, so the single point of accountability as low as possible in the organization that has the capability and resources for success. So if we think about, let's take the sales example again. if I'm the owner of the organization, I'm accountable for the overall performance of the organization. So that's my effective point of accountability. I'm accountable to my shareholders or my investors or to my board if I have one, for the overall performance of the organization. So that's the EPA for that. At the next level down, I would want to have one individual that's the effective point of accountability for sales. So that would be my head of sales, is the effective point of accountability for sales. That person would want to have someone at the next level down that might be accountable for sales in a region or for a product line or for a customer type. And those become the effective point of accountability for those types of sales. So it doesn't give up your accountability and authority for, in the case of the owner, for overall performance, or for the head of sales for overall sales, but it tells you where in the organization who is accountable for what, and what authority the authority is that they have to do this. Again, accountability and authority I could talk about for hours. It's incredibly important in organizations. I've got a lot more resources on my web and my YouTube channel for that, and I'll point you to those at the end of this session. So we're now able to move on to step 3, which is the breaking down of silos. And silos tend to be a major issue inside organizations. Just before we go through on this, I do want to remind you that please, I'm just kind of watching my chat on the side here. If you have any questions about these things, or if there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on in the last 15 minutes, please do drop it in the chat box. I'd be very happy to do that. So here's some research. This came from the work we did with the University of Ottawa. 36% of managers identify that work does not flow smoothly across their organization. That's over a third of managers. And half of managers feel like they're in conflict with others in other parts of the organizations with respect to the accountability that they have in different areas of their work. Here's a research that was published in Harvard Business Review just in 2015. Only 9% of managers in organizations feel that they can rely on their colleagues to do what they say they will do. Now that's incredible, that people in organizations have that lack of sense of how to help with and how to collaborate with each other. They have the goodwill, this felt accountability to help them, say they will, but then for whatever reason, they're not ever able to get to those tasks. Again, because they're so focused within their silo doing what they feel that they need to be doing. And organizations aren't good at resolving these things. As you see here, 38% of the time, they might resolve those conflicts, but that's only after a significant delay. Or it might be resolved quickly but poorly, 14%, or it's just left to fester. I call those playground rules. Work it out for yourselves. So how do you then get the effective point of accountability for cross-functional work? Well, it's more complex, and because it tends not to be done, we have these kinds of issues. Whether it's sales versus manufacturing. So sales is selling the benefits and is selling what they feel they need to sell to clients, and manufacturing is producing what they know they need to do in terms of quality. And often there's a disconnect because sales is overselling and manufacturing isn't able to produce what you get conflict. Same, manufacturing versus service. Service feels manufacturing doesn't have the right quality control, so they're doing more service work than they feel that they should have to. Finance versus projects. I see this in the organizations all the time, where finance is controlling budgets at the detriment of successful projects. And projects doesn't feel like they're getting the cooperation that they should from finance to be able to get what they need when they need it to be able to do good work. Construction versus maintenance. Construction is constructing whatever and puts it in place, and the people that are accountable for maintaining it don't feel that they've met the specs and it's not ready yet to come into service. So all of these things end up in conflict inside organizations, where you have someone in one side of the organization, for example, maybe in ops, and someone on the other side of the organization, maybe in finance or accounting, where they have a disagreement about how best to do their work. And again, this is not because of any ill will. The person in operations wants to do the best job they can. The person in finance wants to do the best job they can, and they're working within the context that they've been given by their manager. So the disconnect is between that context they're receiving from their respective managers, because it's different. The more important weighting in terms of their focus is on their work that they have right in front of them. So what you need in the organization is context that's set more broadly and clearly, starting at the top of the organization. So here's an example. The example would be, I have to put in place, I'm the owner, I've got some investors, and we've been noticing that there's been inventory problems. So I've decided as the owner that I'm going to get some production reports that will give me a better sense of what inventory is being used when for production. So I go to my head accountant or head of finance, whatever that person might be in the organization, and ask them to put together a report, which I'll get on a monthly basis, so I can really track this, because this is an important area to overall profit margins. So finance goes away, comes up with the specs for what this report would look like, develops a draft report, gives it to the head of the organization or the owner, and they say, yep, this is going to do what we need. They sign off on it. So here's the question inside the organization. When does the person in operations, who's going to be accountable for providing all of this information and filling out the form and tracking inventory in a different way, when do they find out that they're going to have this task? Usually when it's somebody at a lower level in finance comes to them or sends them an email and says, here's a new form that I'll need monthly, please have this one in tomorrow morning. And that's immediate conflict, because the person in operations was not planning on doing this. In fact, they view this as finance work. Why is finance coming and giving me some of their work to do? I've got operations work to do. I've got real work to do that I should be working on here. So the way we need to think about delegating this kind of work is the owner needs to bring in both of the involved executives, the people on their team, and have that discussion up front, so that you're setting context both for finance and for operations about why you need this report, what's involved, how do you gather the information, what's the best way to gather it, who's going to fill in the form, who's going to collect the information, what is the accountability and authority in terms of either coordinating or monitoring between finance and operations, so that you have these discussions up front. It's not a surprise, and the context can be set consistently going down the organization, so there's not these surprises, so that people in different parts of the organization don't have to negotiate how they get services from each other. It's part of the accountability and the authority of managers and directors and owners of organizations to do that work. It's not playground work in organizations. So for cross-functional work, the effective point of accountability rests with the position that can decide and direct. So how do we decide what work needs to be done, and how can we direct people to do that work? So if I'm this person in finance that needs to get this report done, I can decide what the report needs to look like, but I can't direct that person in operations to do that work. I'm not their boss. They don't report to me, and they are getting work assigned to them by their respective managers. So what you have to do is go up the organization until you find that common point, that effective point of accountability, that in this case the owner, who has the accountability and the authority to decide what the work will be and to direct people on both sides of the organization to work together. So we've also developed in the effective point of accountability, as we have for managerial work, the key accountability and authority guidelines. And we've done a lot of research and work in this area, finding some of the best systems. Elliot Jacks created a very good but very complex cross-functional accountability and authority framework. Jerry Cranes from Harvard also did some work where he simplified it, and at Effective Managers, what we've done is really get this to the essence of what is the cross-functional work, and there are three types that we've identified. The first one is informing. So who in organizations has accountability and authority for informing others in other parts of the organization about work, and this can be either advising or recommending, so two different types of informing. They may have accountability and authority for persuading. So if they're coordinating a project or if they're monitoring a policy or a process, they may have the accountability and authority to try to persuade someone to work differently if they see things going off the rails. And if they're not successful, they're required to escalate that until you get to the effective point of accountability who can resolve the conflict so that everybody understands that. And the third one is instructing. So you may have the accountability and the authority for someone to instruct someone to do something, even though you're not the boss of that person. So this becomes a really important consideration. We use this as seldom as possible in organizations because this instructing will undermine the authority of the manager, but it's used for certain situations that could impact safety or the well-being of capital equipment and individuals. So for example, a fire marshal would have the authority to instruct people to leave a building during a fire alarm. That's a very simple example, but to give you that. In hospitals, nurses may have the authority will have the authority to provide, to give a prescription to a patient, and the doctor will prescribe that. So the nurse is required to do that, even though the doctor isn't the boss of the nurse. So anyway, just a couple of examples. So I'm just about to come to the end of the slide, and then I want to give you some insight into how you can get a measure of what's happening in your organization. But I wanted to end with this saying from Peter Drucker. I love Peter Drucker's work. He's one of the first solid writers in management sciences, and there's just not enough work in management in terms of understanding who managers are, what managers must do, and having a common language inside organizations for how managers do their work. But the result is that all of these impacts, these three steps, getting these things together, getting all of those different elements of the tree model together, results in a culture in your organization. Remember the first outcome? A culture where people will be focused in on the right work and having the right attitude and doing the right things in terms of how we manage here, how we collaborate here, and so on. And what Peter Drucker wrote, which I think is really, really important, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So bear that in mind. You can have the greatest strategy in the world, the best implementation plan, but if the culture is not consistent, you're not going to be successful. So if anyone's having trouble getting their strategy implemented, think about some of these things that we've talked about. So while you're thinking about questions for me, I'd be delighted to take any questions that we have. I'll stop screen share in just a few minutes, and we can turn on our video cameras to have a bit of a chat. But do put some questions in the chat box. So we've developed over the past, we actually started work on that in Q4 of last year, called the Resilient Organization Program, which was a virtual program. We tested it in January, and luckily it turns out that it was much needed because most of the work of management consultants during this pandemic has moved to virtual support to our client organizations. And we've really focused in on the Resilient Organization Program because we know now that disruption is here, and from those first few slides I showed you at the beginning of the session, it is coming back. Whether it's more kinds of concerns like COVID-19 has raised, I hope not, pray not, or whether it's your industry being disrupted. Think Kodak in films, think Uber, think all of these things that have disrupted industries. We just know from digitization and all of the insights and breakthroughs that are being made that there will be more disruption coming. So the Resilient Organization Program, I've got a full description on my website, but there's 4 key components to it. The first is virtual interviews of the head of the organization and each of their team members to really understand their work, understand things that are going really well in the organization, but get from their perspective, what are the hotspots? What are the things that are getting in the way of them being as successful as they can in the work that they need to do? And by getting that picture across the management team at the top of the organization, an objective observer can get a really good insight into what are some of those key issues that are facing the organization, that if they were resolved, the organization could get rid of some of this churn and be more successful. We've also developed an online survey. It takes an average, so far, of those that have taken it, an average of 11 minutes for employees and 6 minutes for managers. So it's very short, very to the point, but it gives insights into managerial leadership. So are managers doing their managerial leadership work? What's the perception from each team member of that manager of how well they're being managed, basically? It gives you some insight into employee engagement. So how engaged are employees, and by function, how does engagement align inside your organization? We also ask questions about manager effectiveness, so things like clarity of delegation throughout the organization, role conflict in the organization, workflow in the organization, and so on. And then there's a fourth section about support services, so the perception of managers in the organization of the support services. So this can give wonderful heat graphs for the owner of the organization to understand where there may be hotspots in the organization in terms of engagement, or managers not doing their managerial work, or a lack of effectiveness more generally in the organization. I pulled together a report which is concise. It gives some educational components and references to it as well, but then it comes down at the end to a report to recommendations on what are those 1 or 2 or 3 key things that you need to focus in, and then what are all of the other things that we've identified in the organization that could use attention. And then finally, included in the report are facilitated meetings. The first one of the draft report with the owner, just to make sure that the facts are straight and it's meeting the needs of the owner. But then secondly, a second meeting with the owner or the head of the organization and the executive team to provide the results, make sure that there's an understanding, and then to facilitate that decision-making process so that the head of the organization can decide where to move forward. So I see some questions starting to come in. Thank you, Eric. I'll get to that in 1 second. If anyone else has questions, please do get them in there. So do check out our website for the perspectives of clients that we've had. I think you'll find it insightful in terms of some of the services that you can get from effective managers. Now, in terms of resources, I know I've given you a lot of information in a fairly short time. Just to give you some indication, the model that I presented to you this morning, late last year, I put together an 8-hour online education series for senior management consultants, a master class series at CMC Canada. So we covered this kind of thing in 8 hours, but that's more into the how do you actually implement it in organizations. What I wanted to do today is to give you a taste of what some of these root cause issues are, so you can change your thinking about how do you deal with some of the facing problems that you have in the organization. So check out effectivemanagers.com. There's a lot of resources there. We've got a link there to where you can buy my book on the effective CEO as well. Check out my YouTube channel. There's a lot of great video content there. Some of it is short as 5 or 6 minutes on one specific thing. Some that might be as long as an hour, which dive into some of these subjects in much more detail. And then finally, do connect with me. I'd love for you to either subscribe to my e-news or connect with me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. And do check out the resources page, because there's some resources that are free there in terms of white papers, but also some e-learning opportunities for you in those areas. So I'd like to turn now off the share. And we'll turn on the videos. So if anyone that would wants to share their videos so that we can converse a little bit better, please do go ahead and do that. So the first question I have is from Eric. Thank you, Eric. I see Eric's got his video on here. What would be the overriding, informing, and instructing tasks in COVID times with so much work from home? A task ensures that.
And the third grounding as well, I think, was the one in the middle.
Yeah, informing. Exactly.
Persuading.
Informing, persuading. Yeah, I'm just checking to see which ones. Yeah. So all 3 of them. So actually, I've just written a blog article about three back. So in the blog section of my page, I walk through each one of the accountabilities and authorities of a manager, starting with the planning and the value-added work and so on. And I talk about what are some of the key things that you need to think about as a manager. So this again comes back to the context being set with the owner for the organization as a whole. What are the key elements that we need to be focusing in on now that are different from yesterday or last month, or in our case in early March, because the disruption hits each person individually quite differently. And with the work to home, the risk is that managers aren't paying as much attention or being able to give as much context to their subordinate managers as they need to be. So really focusing in as the owner of the organization with each of your team members about how to handle this, and then asking them to do the same at the next level down becomes really, really important. So the informing becomes quite important, because you will have areas of expertise in the organization that may be taking a lead in some areas that might not have been taking that lead earlier. So identifying those, the secret being to make sure that everybody understands they now have that authority to be taking the lead in those areas. Any other questions or comments? Oh, there's one on the problem-solving capability and the maturation process. So that one is something that that we all do need to think about. When I first learned about this process, I was working with the International Red Cross in Geneva, and we were implementing new systems, new ways of operating around the world. And the consultant we had introduced me to this problem-solving capability concept. And at first I thought, that doesn't sound right. You know, anybody can be anything they want to be, right? That's kind of the mantra that individuals have. And the hard reality is that anyone can be anything they want to be within the resources that they have available. So, you know, if I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, I might want to be that very badly, but my body and my skill set aren't such that that's something I'm going to be successful in doing. So we have to change our thinking to also think about problem-solving capability to work at different levels of the organization. And to me, that was one of the biggest breakthrough I had as a head of an organization at that time, and working with others. Ronnie's asking a question: how do you react to reluctance in measuring various accountability indicators? This one I wrestled with actually a lot, Ronnie, in terms of putting the survey together. So for example, one of the measures is each employee answers questions about their manager from their perspective of whether their manager is doing their managerial leadership work. So this becomes available to the owner, who can then see where those hotspots are in the organization. Now this has happened before in terms of things like engagement surveys, where you will be reported by function in terms of where you have the highest engagement and the best engagement. And that has implications for managers, of course. But this is really directly giving feedback to the owner of the organization about who's not doing their managerial leadership work. And this is something where the owner, again, just kind of has to take that accountability to say that I am accountable for this overall organization, and I do want to ensure that all of the managers are doing the things that they should be doing as managers to ensure our success as an organization. So there can be some reluctance there, but we need to set context as heads of organization to help everybody in the organization understand that we measure these things not because we don't care, but because we do care. We want to have a successful organization. We want people to be successful. We want everybody to be focused in on the right work. So in order to be able to do that well, and for me as the head of this organization to do this work well, these are things that we need to measure. And people do come around in organizations where we've done this. It's not the owner that's sitting down, of course, with those managers. It's the owner sitting down with the manager of that manager to make sure that the work is being done. And it's treated as a coaching session. How do we help you to be more effective so that you can do the work that's necessary for us all to be successful? Fred, thank you for this question. How do you prioritize addressing issues in an organization for the most long-lasting impact? That's where we come down to strategy. Part of the hardest work that the head of the organization has is choosing those strategic objectives. And I always say that there should be only 3 or 4 of them. So you go through all of the work of your vision, your mission, your values, but at the end of the day, what are those indicators that I, as the head of the organization, care most about that will show that I've been successful in the long term? And usually it's 3, maybe 4 or 5 years out. A larger organization might go out even a little bit further than that. So what are those 3 or 4 things that I can measure that I want to achieve at the end of that time. Usually profit is one, usually revenue is one, but then customer service might be another one, some types of quality might be another one, there might be something in manufacturing, but not to have a whole checklist of 12 things that I want to accomplish over those next 3 years. What are the 3 or 4 things that are really important? And that is hard work. You have to gather information from all of your team members. You have to do your environmental scans. You have to figure out how you're going to differentiate yourself strategically from your competitors. But at the end of the day, those 3 or 4 things will be the payoff about all of that work that was done. And it's hard work, but it's work that needs to be done. So that's what so it's the work of the owner to come down with that. Because if the owner doesn't do it, then everybody is going to get pulled in different directions, because finance will be trying to figure out what's best for finance because that's their orientation. Operations will try to figure out what's best for operations because that's their orientation, and the owner will lose that opportunity to really drive the priorities throughout the entire organization. So I don't see any more questions coming up here. I thank you for the thank yous, and I thank you for your attention. I know I gave you a lot of information in a short time. If any other questions do come up to you as we're going through this, please do reach out to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Here's the website again, and how you can reach me. Please do reach out to answer any questions, or if you have any questions about how you might apply these things in your situation, I'd very much love to hear from you and have that conversation. So thank you all, and have just an amazing rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.